2018 NATO summit will be held in Brussels in July. Last year, US President Donald Trump blamed his allies for not contributing enough to military expenditure.
23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States. And many of these nations owe massive amounts of money from past years and not paying in those past years.
Will he strengthen the alliance this time or try to cause more disruption? Transatlantic ties have been the pillar of the Western economy. Now, as the US initiates trade disputes with many of its allies, along with other major world economies, will that pillar continue to provide enough support? And how will economic interests affect security issues? Different opinions were highlighted on immigration as Donald Trump compared Germany to a refugee camp. Now, with President Erdogan once again claiming power in Turkey and his focus shifting to the east after years' effort to join the EU, will Europe face a greater refugee challenge? Other differences have also been at issue, such as climate change and the Iran nuclear deal. How will the Western coalition deal with its opposing points of view? Or will it have to wait until the end of Donald Trump's presidency?
Hi there. As the next NATO summit meeting approaches, European members are concerned about one unpredictable factor, Donald Trump. The US president is calling for greater spending by European countries, mixing security issues with trade complaints and criticizing members over immigration and other policies. At the same time, he seems to be at odds with the European thinking over Russia and Vladimir Putin, who views NATO with suspicion. So where is the relationship between NATO and the US headed, and will differences provide new solutions or cause greater disagreement? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Feng Zhongping, Vice President of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, and Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. We shall also talk to Pavel Falkenhor, Russian defense analyst, and Fraser Cameron, director of the EU Asia Center, via satellite. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome back to our discussion here, gentlemen. Do you think President Trump is likely to divide NATO or, contrarily, bring members of the bloc closer?
Well, I think, people are talking about the dying, of NATO.
NATO is dying?
Yeah, but I think it's exaggerated.
That's pretty sensational.
Yeah, I don't think that will happen because, for Europeans, they still need NATO. I will tell you why. Because they are thinking about collective defense. The meaning of collective defense means they need NATO to help them to stop an invasion of great power. They normally refer to Russia. From the America's point of view, I think Donald Trump don't like NATO, but he's not going to destroy NATO. He's angry with the way the NATO is operating. He's very angry about the defense spending. He thinks this is not fair. The United States spent too much on the European defense, but he's not going to destroy this.
I mean, Donald Trump deeply has a culture of victimization, that he is a victim, that the United States is a victim of its allies taking advantage of it. There is a legitimate issue about the amount of money Europeans have put in to NATO for the common defense. In effect, for 70 years, the United States has subsidized the military defense of Europe in exchange for a political alliance. Trump wants to change the post-World War II architecture, and I don't think he wants to break up NATO, but I think he wants to change it fundamentally and recast NATO for the future years.
Arguably, what President Trump stands for could be viewed as something related to Union isolationism, which started from the farewell speech of George Washington and perhaps a series of neutral acts prior to the Second World War. Let me go to Pavel, who's standing by in Moscow, and share his comments on whether the threat of Russia is looming larger following Crimea, invasion of Georgia, and particularly your formidable military presence in Syria. Pavel, what are your thoughts?
Well, the West and Russia have been at loggerheads. The war in Georgia no late after the West decided that this, well, was an unpleasant incident, but not really a game changer after Crimea and then the Donbass, and right now a standoff in Syria. This has caused something of a new Cold War. But again, in the West, there are different opinions. Those who believe that Russia should be, the West should be working on deterring Russia, on stopping it, and those who believe that Russia is not really an enemy, that Russia has its own national interest, but they don't go much further than the borders of the former Soviet Union and traditional Russian influence zones, and that the West and in America there's also those, the kind of the political base of Donald Trump. Yes, it's isolationist. It's been isolationist always. They don't understand why America should spend treasure and lives of its sons and daughters to fight for interests of what they believe is the Washington establishment, the swamp in Washington. So, and since right now going into the midterm elections, Trump is kind of boosting his political base and having a trade war with these Western allies. Well, that's actually mobilizing his base. So he most likely will continue doing that even in the coming summit in July.
Pretty articulate in the West to build the relevance between the future of NATO and midterm elections, namely domestic politics of the United States after Trump won the campaign. Now, the issue is, what do you think of this? The formidable Russian military presence amassed along the front line against the three Baltic states. You are 10 times as many as the symbolic presence of NATO troops in the three Baltic states. What do you think is the major threat to Russia?
The Russian military believe that Russia is actually surrounded on all sides, that the present strategic understanding coming from our general staff is that in the future decade or two there could be world crises connected to lack of resources, especially oil and gas, and the present price of oil going down a couple of years ago was just a fluctuation, that this crisis may come, and that Russia may be under attack from different sides by nations that would want to take over Russian natural resources. And the Russian military are using such assessment to clamor for more defense spending, and Russian defense spending has gone up rather dramatically, to build up defenses, including defenses in the West, but also in the North, in the East. And yes, Russia has more troops on the borders of the Baltics and Poland than the West has at present. And more importantly, Russia can bring in more troops from the Russian hinterland much quicker than the West can. So technically, the coming summit is going to be about the West hammering out plans of logistic plans, mostly a reinforcement of forward positions. But Trump could actually spoil the game by going for allies demanding more of them to spend more, and for many, including Germany, that's not an option. The German public doesn't want to spend more.
Clearly, the NATO leaders are aware of Russian capability to mobilize their military might very quickly. In response to that, I learned that NATO has been able to quicken the rapid deployment from 9 days to 5 days in an emergency case. So, Rick, do you believe Russia or President Trump would come across as a troublemaking factor when we examine the future of NATO?
Well, I think Donald Trump is more of an immediate problem than Russia is to NATO, because he is aiming right at the mission of NATO, and he is splitting NATO because he is saying you shouldn't worry about Russia, and others want to worry about Russia. So I mean, I think that that's more of an issue. It's very hard to get unanimity at NATO if Donald Trump says no.
Well, we've heard what President Trump said in the opening footage. He said it's unfair for American taxpayers to cover the defense spending of our European allies. He called for the other 23 member states to increase their share of the defending by 2% of their GDP individually. So do you think that's very, very difficult for domestic politics in NATO and particularly in, for example, the older European countries where they face the rise of populism and protectionism?
But I think the difficulties is there, especially because of populism. But I think Donald Trump's techniques will work. You know, and actually more and more countries in Europe, with this NATO framework, they started to increase their defense year by year. Germany is probably exceptional, but it agrees to by 2024 it will go to a certain point. We're not going to 2%, but it will go to something like a 1.9 or something, 1.8 or. But you see, it actually works. I think why? Because more and more people in Europe think NATO is very important for them, but Donald Trump, the people who lead NATO, is not reliable at all, no longer reliable. So they started to think, oh, we need to wake up. How to wake up? They need to, to have their own defense capabilities.
But the UK turned out to be the very first one to reject the idea of having its own independent rapid deployment of troops within the framework of the European Union, saying, well, much of the functions of the newly established European forces will be overlapping with that of the NATO. Well, with the Brexit around the corner, do you think what the Britain stands for will hold any water?
It's always very tricky, Countries like UK think if we strengthen our European military force, it will probably make the Americans are not happy with this development. But with Donald Trump, he prefers to say this. So I think because of Donald Trump's changed perception of this whole defense expenditure, and also because of Brexit, so we could clearly say the attitudes in London has been shifted. 2 or 3 days ago, UK decided to join with Italy, France and Germany in setting up not European Union defense force, European defense force. Why? Because UK is going to leave the European Union. So we see the changes, the mood in London for preferring a European strong military force.
Let's move from our discussion about the defense spending to yet another case that threatens to trigger a crisis, even to endanger the future of NATO, for example, the Iran nuclear deal. European strategic and business stakes will be seriously hurt by the pullout, a unilateral one, by Washington from this 6+1 nuclear deal. What do you think of the concerns of European politicians about the nuclear deal and the problems of this pullout that may undermine the strength and solidarity of the NATO?
Well, I think that there is a threat to the solidarity of NATO, both from the Iran nuclear deal, United States pulling out, and the trade war, and Donald Trump unilaterally slapping tariffs on Europe, saying it's in the interests of U.S. national security to have these tariffs. I think that this puts all the European politicians, the Western European politicians, in a very difficult situation. Do they stand up to Donald Trump, or do they appear weak at home?
Rick, I don't think Donald Trump would be one to blink in the standoff between the European allies and Washington over NATO. But something that has left me deeply puzzled about the policy options of Washington regarding a nuclear deal is why it seems Washington has come under heavy influence from Israel, at the risk of confronting all European allies, particularly all Arabs.
Well, I think it is wrong to blame Israel. I think this is Donald Trump trying to undo Barack Obama. Yes, Israel was strongly against it. Israel was strongly against it
Anything
when Barack
but Obama.
Obama was for it. Right, exactly. Whatever Obama was for, I'm against.
I think he believes the Iranian nuclear agreement doesn't work very well. But for Europeans, okay, it's not perfect. We can reform it. But to totally destroy it is another thing. And the Europeans think the Iranian nuclear agreement is their security interest. A lot of people think it's the economic interest because there are many European companies are now investing, operating in Iran. But the truth is, they think this is a security interest.
Would you elaborate a bit further about their security concerns regarding the nuclear capability of the Persian state?
Exactly. I think Europeans, the last thing they want to say is Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon.
Is that likely to cause a nuclear proliferation, nuclear arms race in the Middle East? What are their security concerns, Rick? What are your thoughts?
Well, if you're looking from Europe's perspective, they don't want another arms race. If Iran has nuclear weapons, the question is Saudi Arabia, because that's the delicate balance in the Middle East, and also the question of whether Israel or the United States would bomb Iran. So I think Europe wants stability. Europe also wants trade. There are profits to be made in Iran, and Europe has a huge advantage over the United States in moving in and getting those deals.
Pavel, Russia is one of the P5 of the UN Security Council and one party of the 6+1 nuclear deal regarding Iran's nuclear capability. What is the position of Moscow?
Well, of course, Russia very much supports the Iran nuclear deal. And Russia and Iran are close partners, and actually in Syria there's Russian planes in the skies and Iranian, pro-Iranian militias fighting on the ground. But at the same time, Russia has a very close partnership with Israel too. And Russia is trying to be in the Middle East a kind of balancing power, kind of an arbiter. Having very good relations with all parties and seeing that that is a strategic advantage over the United States, though Russia has much scarcer resources militarily and financially and economically in the Middle East. It speaks to everyone and is connected to everyone. And unlike the United States, which has abundant resources but doesn't have a coherent strategy in the region or maybe in other places too. And that's seen as the Russian advantage. Basically, when Iran gets into trouble, when it's in sanctions, it turns to Russia. It's such a tradition. When sanctions are eased, Iran turns to the West because the technologies it needs and the investment it needs is not in Russia, it's in the West. So for this situation right now with the Iran nuclear deal is seen in Russia as something of an opportunity, and of course we oppose the American unilateral withdrawal from that agreement.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Fraser Cameron, who's standing by in Brussels, the headquarters of NATO. Hello, Fraser. Do you think the 6+1 nuclear deal from which the United States pulled out unilaterally will seriously credit the American world leadership, and therefore NATO is likely to fall apart?
Well, it's certainly going to make a dent in American leadership, but it's going too far to say that NATO will fall apart. I think the Europeans plus the Chinese, Russians, others will try and salvage the deal because it's really important in terms of nuclear non-proliferation. But I think NATO will have its difficulties when they have the summit next month, but it's not going to fall apart because of Iran.
Very quickly, what do you think of the possibility for the other 23 member states of the NATO to increase their defending shares in line with the request of President Trump?
Well, about half of them are on the way to doing this. The big problem country is, of course, Germany, the largest country in Europe, which is way behind its commitments, and that's why Donald Trump is attacking Germany in so many fronts just now, including threatening to put 25% tariffs on German car exports to the United States. So I think NATO is doing a reasonable job, but it's not going to satisfy Donald Trump next month.
I'm a little bit surprised that Germany has been singled out for the bashing over the issue of defense spending. Here in the Beijing studio, we have said and discussed enough issues like the factor of unpredictable presidency of Donald Trump, as well as the alleged threat from Russia regarding the future of NATO. But what about Turkey? Turkey has been rejected ruthlessly by the European Union for its membership. However, it remains a very subtle but important member of the NATO. Currently, President Erdogan is accused by Europeans and Americans of exercising strongman politics, if not dictatorship. Well, that's a pretty strong word. So what do you think of the uncertainty of President Erdogan following the election concerning the future of NATO and its solidarity? That's the crux of the issue.
Well, I think that the Europeans are stuck with Erdogan, and so is NATO. Turkey has the second largest army in NATO. It's an important military power. At the same time, it's conducting operations in Syria and Iraq contrary to the United States and most other NATO allies. So it's a mixture of needing Turkey for the geopolitical role it plays, but at the same time there are a number of differences in terms of its foreign policy. And of course, there are concerns about the democratic credentials now of Turkey.
Thank you so much. What do you think of Turkey?
I think, Turkey joined NATO at the very beginning, that shows Turkey is very important for the, cross-Atlantic allies in terms of military. That was the Cold War period. But Turkey is always easy partner for Western countries. For example, let me give you a good example. Turkey has applied for joining the European Union much longer than any Central Eastern European countries. Turkey first made the application in 1960s, much earlier than Poland and Hungary.
Yes, yet another long march.
That was not a European Union. That time it was a European community even. The reason, the European community or European Union refused to offer membership to Turkey is because especially because of democratic, political reasons. So I think Turkey will serve good use for NATO in terms of military defense, but they always disagree with Turkey in terms of so-called Western values.
Other than the future of NATO, solidarity, nuclear deal with Iran, and the factor for Russia, Donald Trump's presidency, we have a question about the role of the NATO with the end of the Cold War in 1991. Whether member states, most of them, agree to go beyond the borders of member states of the NATO, for example, to be involved in the maritime patrol in the South China Sea. I mean, since the United States calls for restricting the alleged assertiveness of the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea, do you think key member states like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom are likely to be part of the freedom of operation?
Well, I do think, whether it's Donald Trump involved or not, I do think that Germany, France, UK see themselves as the leaders of the free world now, and I think that they, whether the United States agrees or not, will want to continue to be a counterweight to China and to Russia. The question really is what we talked about before. Do they want to spend the money on military? Do they want to step up, or do they want to be under the American umbrella?
Let me correct my slip of tongue. It's not freedom of operation, but freedom of navigation.
Yes.
And the freedom of overflight in the South China Sea. What do you think of China's position on the future of NATO? We are a very special strategic partnership of Moscow. We don't want to see mounting tensions in continental Europe. And we collectively believe with Russia that the future of the world's co-prosperity somehow lies in the Euro-Asian continent. And through the functions and role of SCO, Russia and China could join hand in shaping and navigating a new course of the geopolitical reconfiguration somehow with the end of the Cold War in 1992. What do you think of our concerns about NATO in this broad context?
Let me tell you, I disagree with a lot of things Donald Trump is saying, is doing. But when Donald Trump was, during his election campaign 1.5 years ago, he said NATO was obsolete. I think he has some right reasons to say that, actually. NATO was created in 1949. That was a Cold War product. I can understand why the European countries still would like to NATO remain, because they regard it as an insurance. A lot of countries in Europe, if you ask European people, do you still need NATO? They say yes. Why? For insurance reasons. So I can understand why they need NATO, but NATO is not something really useful. It's old way of thinking, to have military allies, and then you have an enemy. That is not a way for us to approach in 21st century.
That's a very good question. Let me go back to Fraser. Do you think the functions of NATO are moribund to a large degree?
Well, I think until the Russian actions in Crimea, there was a growing body of opinion questioning the validity of NATO. But after Russia invaded Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine, following on its annexation of parts of Georgia, I don't think there was any doubt in Western minds that NATO still had a purpose, and that has now been the unanimous position of all NATO governments.
But the issue, Fraser, I'm afraid, is Ukraine has been rejected by NATO to be a member of this military bloc. And Crimea is and remains a very controversial issue. Dr. Henry Kissinger, for example, somehow disagrees with Dr. Brzezinski on the history and necessity of Crimea being part of Russia. I mean, among the Americans, they have different perspectives from the historians and the masters of geopolitics. How could you persuade most European taxpayers that Russia comes across as a major threat, hence the legitimacy of NATO, which is, as Mr. Feng Zhongping said wisely in the Beijing studio, was a product of the Cold War back in 1949?
Well, it's a question of how you actually change borders in today's world. You can change borders by agreement, but if you change borders by force, which is what Russia has done in several cases, then you have to have an international response to that. And that's what NATO has done in Europe, saying enough is enough. You can't go on like this. You can't continue to interfere in the internal political systems of member states without some retaliation. So I think, Russia basically could, by playing its cards differently, probably have achieved the dissolution of NATO. But in the last few years, I think it has now realized that the West is prepared to push back, and NATO will continue to exist.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, Mr. Feng, do you think the occupation and or takeover of Crimea is a product of a very tricky ouster and coup attempt sponsored allegedly by the United States when Viktor Yanukovych was driven out of Kiev a few years ago, and hence out of great anger Russia decided to retaliate and retaliated by taking back Crimea?
Russia did this with they think that we had a referendum, They think that, the coup took place it's a colorful revolution. So Russia has, this action actually made Putin's supporting rate has been very high.
Yes, the supporting rate or approval rate of Mr. Vladimir Putin soared as a result of taking back Crimea, which he thought has always remained an indispensable part of the Russian Federation. With that, we come to the end of this dialogue on the future of NATO and whether President Trump will be a troublemaker. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.